Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Notre Dame and another day at the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture Fall Conference. Always a phenomenal event, great community building. We're here today at the Education and Personalism session. My name is Bill Mattison. I teach moral theology here, and it's great to have you all here. We got a fantastic lineup of speakers on a topic that's close to all of our hearts who are involved in education and scholarship. So education and personalism. As you may know, we're going to have 3 20-minute sessions. The speaker can speak the whole time, or if there's a little time left, we might have time for a question, but we'll stop it at 20 minutes, and that'll leave 15 or maybe 10 at the end for questions. And I'm going to introduce them individually, because no one remembers the third person if I say them all now. So we're going to go in the order of your program and start with, we're going to start here with Blaise. Is it Ringor or Ringor? Ringor. So here we go. So Blaise Ringor has his Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy at the Immaculate Conception Major Seminary. He finished both his Master's of Arts in Philosophy and PhD in Philosophy at the Pontifical and Royal University of Santo Tomas, Manila, where he's currently a teacher and a research associate under the Research Center for Theology, Religious Studies, and Ethics. His research interests are Thomistic philosophy, real phenomenology, and personalist philosophy. Some of his publications include a book chapter in Routledge's Education in an Age of Lies and Fake News, Regaining a Love of Truth, and the essays entitled The Attitude of Opposition as a Service to Truth in Karol Wojtyła's Philosophy of Community. One of his most recent publications in personalist philosophy can be found in the Social Ethics Society's special issue with the title She Will Crush Thy Head, Edith Stein's Emancipative Empathy as a Critical Voice Against Neoliberalism in Education. So without further ado, Tomas.
Thank you so much for welcoming me here, and to all the organizers, I really thank you for giving me a chance to speak. So the title of my paper that I will be presenting today is Self-Gift and Gratitude, John Paul II's Personalist Ethics of Education. So let me start. What does it mean to educate? The Latin word educere, which is derived from the prefix e, means out of, and dux or ducis means to lead. Hence, literally, education means to lead out of. But from where does education lead the person out of? In the ancient period, Socrates demonstrated that education should be for the sake of truth. The value of truth is more important than life, as he embraced death in serving the truth. This separates him from the sophists who practice education for money over truth and sustain their market by saying flattery over honesty. Plato in the Republic, through his allegory of the cave, narrated the fate of the prisoner who reached the top of the cave and escaped it. This prisoner, who learned that the objects on the walls were mere shadows of reality, has the task to go back and teach the remaining prisoners about truth. But the prisoners will surely choose to kill him rather than believe him. In short, to be an educator means to be a martyr for truth. Aristotle, in his work Metaphysics, he emphasized that the wise man is the one who seeks knowledge for its own sake. Similarly, the educator should educate for the sake of truth alone and not for any other ends that are merely contingent rather than necessary. No less important are the lessons from the medieval age, where most philosophers married reason with faith, who made philosophy not only a beginning of wonder, but also a search for the divine with the hope to answer the question which Tertullian remarkably asked, Quid ergo Athenis et Hierosolimis? What has Athens got to do with Jerusalem? One learns from Augustine that education should not only for the advancement of the city of man, but also for the glory of the Civitas Dei, the city of God. He also taught that one cannot reach the truth without the aid of divine illumination. In short, education should affirm that the mind ascends as it tries to reach the truth because it moves from the material to the spiritual. Moreover, Aquinas taught that education should necessarily be virtuous. For instance, he distinguished studiositas from curiositas, where the former restrains the person from excessively desiring both sense knowledge and intellectual knowledge, while the latter refers to the intemperance for both sense knowledge and intellectual knowledge. Finally, the tables have turned when Occam denied the universals in things that have led to the conception that material things have nothing in common with their creator. In effect, reason has been detached from its rope to heaven. Modernity entered history. René Descartes, who was responsible for separating the soul from the body, when he came up with his famous res cogito and res extensa, where doubt became universal, and where God assumed the position of merely being a provider of truth instead of the truth himself, as if the solipsistic cogito exists only for its own. Consequently, which is separate from becoming a virtuous person. Through this, education parted ways with transcendence, as it separated the soul from the body. After Descartes, one can also find Rousseau, who asserted that man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. Emile, the fictional character in his work about education, inspired revolution and emancipation from obedience to others and respect to tradition, as it only concerned itself to know his own mind. In effect, education should create its own meaning. It should not be influenced by any authority, even if it is the authority of truth. These two modern ideas gave birth to scientism, which reduced the person into a mere scientific datum, and that reduced the truth to things that the instrument of scientific methods can validate. Individualism also followed, which glorifies the individual over and against other persons that are in the community, and collectivism, which vilifies the individual good of the person. These ideas are certainly responsible for the continued threat and exploitation of the dignity of the human person. Education is not exempted from the problematic influences and effects of modernity through scientism, individualism, and collectivism. History attests to the crimes that were done by educated professionals, or whom we also call as intelligent monsters, who used science to collaborate with the murderer, an individualist intellectual that was worried about self-preservation to the point that he wanted to control the population, and a collectivist genius who declared himself as the dictator and held power even if it means killing his own compatriots. Today, the commodification of education is the surest creation of these problems. For one, it separates positive sciences by degrading the worth of humanities. It fixes its attention on measure and the income that will be generated by boosting the ranking, and it injects the idea of capitalism in education, that profit is greater than the dignity and worth of the person, as everyone is dissolved into mere numbers. Much worse is the reduction of excellence and goodness in metrics. You are a good administrator if you can manage, by all means, all of the tasks under your care, irrespective of how inhumane your methods is. You are a good teacher if you produce numerous research outputs, even if it means cheating on its process. And you are a good student if you achieve a high grade, regardless of whether you achieve it with all honesty and sacrifices. A commodified educational system has lost its sight of the person. It turns from self-dedication to self-gratification. Hence, should we be surprised if the students of today will become the tyrants of tomorrow? Clearly, knowing the truth and doing the good should be the fundamental reasons for education, unless we want to repeat the crimes of yesterday. Worse is when educators concede to Shakespeare's Hamlet, who claim that conscience does make cowards of us all. Thus, the threat to truth and good in a depersonalized education is a threat to the human person. This is the reason for the urgency of a personalist education. In this research, I argue that John Paul II's personalist ethics of self-gift and gratitude can serve as one of the adequate responses to these problems in education. Hence, the task of this paper is to answer the question, how can John Paul II's personalist ethics of self-gift and gratitude respond to the commodification of education. John Paul II distinguished the cosmological view of the person from the personalist concept of the person. The former sees the person from the perspective of an observer. In other words, externalities. For instance, Aristotle asserts that man is a rational animal who is distinct from brutes that only rely on sensations. Subsequently, Thomas Aquinas points out the recognition of imago Dei in the person because persona est, perfectissimum ens. The person is the most perfect being in the created world. While affirming these principles about the person, John Paul II did not turn a blind eye to its weakness in the contemporary period. Furthermore, Boethius defined the person as individua substantia rationalis naturae, or the person is an individual substance of a rational nature. Here, John Paul II affirmed the importance of this by saying that Boethius led us to the metaphysical terrain with this anthropological formulation. For this, John Paul II calls the traditional view of the person objective, that is, seeing the person as one with the objects of the world by virtue of the person's corporeality. While these views are true, John Paul II argues that it must be completed with the personalistic view, which sees the person from the point of view of his interiority that ultimately leads to spirituality. Through this, the person is revealed to himself as a personal subject, therefore completing objectivity with subjectivity. That leads John Paul II to contend that the person is both a subject and an object at once. This makes the person unique and unrepeatable. Thus, his existence is a gift of divine creation that can never be repeated. This is why the person is irreducible to anything. In 1972, John Paul II highlighted in Redemptor Hominis, his encyclical letter, the indispensable value of love in human person's existence. He explains that man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible for himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him, if he does not encounter love, if he does not experience it and make it his own, if he does not participate intimately in it. This love is made possible through self-gift, which is conditioned by personal subjectivity of the person. So the personal subjectivity of the person allows the person to be self-possessed. This means that while having his roots in the divine, he is at the same time at his own disposal. He is free. This is what Wojtyła means when he says that the person is sui juris, the master of himself. This implies accountability and responsibility for the efficacious actions of the person, since part of his dignity is his incommunicability. No one can will and act on this specific action other than myself. John Paul II paired this with self-determination when the person chooses to act based on truth and good, best expressed as, I can but I need not. This rejection of morally evil action leads the person towards self-fulfillment. All of these are conditioned by conscience, which guides the person to affirm the good, and by transcendence, which enables the person to subordinate his freedom to the truth. Indeed, only a self-possessed person can give himself as a sincere gift to others. Only a person with self-determination can reject what is morally evil, which is counterintuitive to loving. Only a conscientious person who can transcend his actions can truly make himself a sincere gift to others. This self-gifting, however, does not make a person any less. By contrast, it perfects the person. Through the gift of the self, in the moral sense, as John Paul II says, the person does not lose anything, but becomes richer instead. This follows that a person who makes himself a sincere gift to others is a person full of gratitude, because another person received him and affirmed his being as a gift, and not just merely another object among any beings in the world. By contrast, a person becomes sorrowful when he is exploited, when being treated as a means to an end, instead of an end in himself. That is to say, when the person is reduced to a mere object of use, instead of being treated as an object and subject of love. No less important is the community, where the person is formed through participation. Besides, this is where gratitude is formed. In his philosophy of the community, John Paul II highlights the complementary role of both the individual good and the common good in community and participation. He also distinguished the authentic attitudes and non-authentic attitudes of participation. The former comprises the attitude of solidarity, the attitude of opposition, and the principle of dialogue. The latter is composed of conformism and avoidance. If the person adheres to authentic attitudes, he will be able to participate correctly. While if the person concedes to non-authentic attitudes, he will experience alienation. This leads to the fact that only a grateful person can participate authentically because he is humble enough to open himself in dialogue with others. He is receptive to any constructive opposition to his claims, ideas, and proposal, knowing that he does not have the monopoly of truth. And finally, he is not indifferent to his neighbors, allowing him to give importance in taking an active part in solidarity with others. John Paul II's personalist ethics responds to the problems of scientism, individualism, and collectivism, which are affecting education. Hence, by applying these principles in education, I find that John Paul II teaches the following. First, education is scientific but not scientistic. This is in response to scientism. John Paul II follows the Thomistic ontology of hylomorphism. He believes that matter is equally important as the form. The body is as important as the soul. The same thing is true when it comes to education. Certain methods of science work and must be applied whenever necessary, but they cannot be an absolute source of truth in education, and the only method that we can use. Besides, the term science comes from the Latin word scientia, which can be translated as knowing. Thus, being in the position of a knower means being at the mercy of truth and its ultimate source, who is God. John Paul II also contends that education is personal because only a person can be educated. He says education is creativity concerning the most personal object. As always and only a person is educated, whereas an animal can only be trained, and at the same time, creativity in the material that is entirely human. Everything that is by nature contained in the man being educated constitutes material for educators, material which their love should employ. Nevertheless, education for John Paul II is counter-individualism because education for him is neither a service for utilitarian ends, that is, using the person as a means to an end, instead of treating the person as an end in himself, nor a commodity for the exponential growth of profit. Education for John Paul II is personal because it places the person above anything else. For the proper response to the person is through a disinterested love. Third, education is communal but not collectivistic. Following John Paul II's principles, education should be a form of correct participation. It is dialogical in the sense that the search for truth is seen not only from one perspective because of the conviction that every person is a contributor to reaching the truth. Subsequently, education is also a form of solidarity because as searchers for truth, no one is superior or inferior. It is done in cooperation together with others. Following this, the teacher and the students become co-educators as they learn from one another. This is not the same as removal of authority. By contrast, this is a kind of restoration of the authority of truth. Moreover, education necessitates constructive opposition because truth is not monopolized by one person, for the humble acceptance of a mistake is a manifestation of a person's receptivity to truth and willingness to be educated by it. This directly contrasts collectivism, which is characterized by conformism and avoidance, that makes persons apathetic to each other. Fourth, education is self-donation, because teaching the truth is a disinterested gift to others insofar as it requires the courage to be rejected and hated for defending it. Thus, to educate means to make oneself as a gift to others without asking for any return, other than to become a living witness of truth and good. Lastly, education is transcendental because it goes beyond what is merely superficial and principally leads the person not only to the knowledge of what is true. Here, I find knowledge not something that is entirely a mental exercise, but most importantly, to the subordination of his freedom to truth, revealed through choosing to do the morally good actions. In fact, John Paul II argues that education precedes and conditions all moral values. That, thus, it must teach self-possession, self-governance, and self-determination that leads the person to self-fulfillment and transcendence of his actions, not only in his personal life, but even in the sphere of his chosen profession. To conclude, John Paul II's personalist ethics of education is an adequate response to the commodification of education, which is the result of scientism, individualism, and collectivism, whose common ground is ungratefulness to truth, and its source that leads to exploitation of the person. This is because his personalist ethics teaches the value of sincere gift of the self, which springs from disinterested love for others that is rooted in gratitude to God, the wellspring of virtue and the source of truth. Against commodified education, through John Paul II's personalist ethics of education, we could expect educated professionals to be in the service of the person and not a profit out of their practice. For what does it profit a man if he gains the world and loses his soul? Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks to Professor Ringor. Real treat to introduce from the University of Dallas, Professor Greg Roper. He's got some fantastic titles you have to hear here. So he's Associate Professor of English at Dallas at UD, and since October 2021, the Dean of Students. He's published on Chaucer, the Gawain Poet, and medieval penitential manuals. His book, The Writer's Workshop, in 2007, opened up a new emphasis on the art of imitation in the teaching of writing, especially in classical education circles. And his forthcoming book, Mastering the Four Arguments, uses the oft-neglected ancient concept of stasis theory to help students shape clearer and more compelling persuasive writing. He's currently completing a book tentatively titled Brainworms and Core Truths, 20 Silly Shibboleths of a Progressive Education and 10 Sanities of a Liberal One. And this year he wrote his university's orientation book, A Well-Lived Life, on how a liberal education can be applied to students' everyday lives. Please welcome with me Professor Roper.
We're going to need to. Thank you. It's so wonderful. This is my third time here. It's my favorite conference I've ever been to. It's just such a delight thinking and learning through these concepts. Last year, I gave a little talk about student life where I talked about 5 principles or 5 things we need to get right. And the first one was that we have to get the anthropology right. And so when I saw the title this year of this year's conference, it's like, oh, I'm going to be swimming in a tub of butter. What I didn't realize is that I would learn so much and be scribbling so many notes from every session about the person that I had to rewrite my talk entirely last night. So you're going to get one of those presentations. I'm sorry. He's going to have to be flagging me because this is not as organized as I generally hope it to be. Someone asked me last night as we were walking out of dinner and found out I was a dean of students. By the way, my academic colleagues are always asking me, like, when are you going to get back to real work? And this person asked me, like, so what do you do? And unfortunately, Joe Wirtz, who has my role at Benedictine College, is laughing back there. Unfortunately, I answered in terms of my org chart. I said, well, I'm over student activities, and I'm over residence life, and I'm over housing, and I'm over the health clinic and the counseling center, which seems, it struck me as like a really stupid answer. That's not really what I do. We're in the dust, Joe and I. We deal with the daily stuff. we're down in the messiness of life. We're the ones, well, Joe knows this, we're the ones who answer the phone call at 2:30 in the morning for the student who was convinced by his friends, even though he has severe asthma, that he should try smoking cigars. And there may have been a little bit of alcohol involved in that, but I'm there at the ER with that student. That's what we do. We deal with, leaky faucets and, lights not turning on the lacrosse field and all those sorts of things. The fun of the day is that every day is different. And we're dealing in the messiness of life. But what I realized from Craig Calhoun's talk on Thursday night is what we do is really help design a city. I love this phrase he had, right? To create the conditions to achieve the public good. That's, I think, what a dean of students, is a major part of. Now, we have to have gratitude, I think, for the cities we've inherited. And I've inherited an amazing city at the University of Dallas, right? A community where, in his phrase, students, he said people, right? But students learn discipline. And I love this quotation he had, good people make good cities, and good cities guide them to personal and political good. The little polis that a university is, that I've always loved ever since I first came to college, is the wonder, it seems to me, of the American university, is that we have these little polises that are designed to help people to personal and political good. That's what keeps me up at night. Well, actually, it doesn't keep me up at night because I'm old and I become my father and I fall asleep at 9:30 at night. But it's what wakes me up at 3 or 4 in the morning and gets my brain spinning immediately, what we're going to do. Because often the citizens, and Carter Sneed is right about this, often the citizens who come to us at age 18 have been steeped in, breathe the oxygen of what he's been calling expressive individualism. And they are, they're struggling, it seems to me, with all of the problems that Carter says about expressive individualism. They think that it's about their will shaping their world, and that they struggle with the difference between liberty and license. They struggle to find ways to become fully human in that world. Now, we have great tools at UD. We have this wonderful core curriculum that sticks the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid in their hands right away, and they spend 10 weeks at the same time on the Republic. So my colleagues are doing wonderful, wonderful things to help our little polis become a place of habits and virtues that are very strong. UD students themselves, the good news and the gratitude I have, the Princeton's Review called us recently the second most religious student body in the country. I'm not sure how you measure that, but that's what they've decided, and that we're the sixth, get this, not the first, second, third, the sixth happiest student body. Which is really a delight, and it's wonderful to know. And we just went through a very happy time we call Charity Week, where the students earned $40,000 for 2 charities by various things like throwing their professors in jail. UD students are, I actually coined this phrase, I'm actually sort of proud of this phrase. I say UD students at their best are playfully serious and seriously playful. They take their studies very seriously, but themselves not too seriously. And they have a sort of goofiness to them that's delightful. I think that if our students were in 1560 Rome, they wouldn't have gone down to the Gesù to be with St. Ignatius, right, a military, an ex-military person. They would have gone the other way to the Chiesa Nova to be with St. Philip Neri. They would have helped him steal the cardinal's dog. That's a UD student. So we do our best to get the anthropology right. And I've been just swimming all week long in people talking about getting the anthropology right on these amazing levels of John Paul II's ideas and many other ideas. And the whole time I've been thinking, like, how do I bring that down to earth? How do I bring that down into the dust? How do I bring that down into a dorm? And we start in some ways now, for the last 2 years, we haven't had orientation week, we've had disorientation week. And I credit that to a Cistercian who I taught, who said, I'm tired of all of these silly labels for Orientation Week, like building bridges. He said, let's do something that actually reflects us. And he said, call it anything but like building bridges. Call it disorientation. And so we now first try to disorient our students from expressive individualism from the very first day they're on campus and try to reorient them to the notions of the person as relation and to try to do that. And Michael Waldstein, who changed my life the other day, said this amazing thing. He said, in the Trinity, relation is not something added to the person, but is the person himself. And to get students out of expressive individualism and to help them see that they are born into relation. From the minute they are conceived, they are someone's son, daughter, grandson, grandfather. And in fact, of course, Jeremiah 1:5, before you were in the womb, I knew you. So they are in relation to God before they're in the womb. But even as they arrive on campus, they are in relation. I ask my RAs all the time, how are your students? How are your residents? They are someone's student. They are someone's advisee. They are enmeshed in this tissue of relations. That is how we form a community. And we try to do everything we can to foster that. We have what's called Monday night meetings in the dorms where they have to listen to me yammer about various topics for just 20 minutes, but just to get them out of their dorms, looking at one another, actually, sitting in a room together, out of their rooms, off of their screens, staring at one another just for a half an hour, and listen to a talk by some of us, and begin to form community in that way. Our dorms are all named after saints, and we began this year having them celebrate their feast days. It was a little tough for Augustine, that's right away, at the very beginning of school, and then my feast day is September 3rd, so it sort of challenged them, but they got together, we cooked spaghetti carbonara, a very Roman dish, for 3 hours. Teresa did even better on October 15th, but as that way of mapping over what we have as a resource as a Catholic community and forming community for themselves and beginning to do that. From Father Jack Green this week, I learned this marvelous paper, I hope you'll write to him, from Nicholas of Cusa about being seen. And I think this is a great and important task of all of us, is to make sure our students are seen. Right? And by the way, this is the opposite, I think, of the Foucauldian panopticon, which is, I think, sometimes what the students think I'm doing to them, like I'm examining them, watching them every minute of the day to make sure they're not misbehaving. No, right? Being seen in the way Nicholas of Cusa is talking about is that notion that we have, that we are seen by God at every moment, and we are loved by God by being seen. That is, it's the opposite of a solipsism, to know that we are being seen. But we're seen right now, not in our relationality, but even in our individuality and in our subjectivity. And it allows, Father said, a participatory freedom in God loving us. I think that's something I know I could do better. I know I would love to know that the students feel that they're seen by me. I suck at names, and I've got to get better at names, because you can't feel seen unless you're called by your name. The next, Andrew Cathler, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, said that the next step is a sense of mission, right? And it does come from this sense of a thick texture of relationships that we have, right? That a sense of mission deals with our origins, but it deals also with where we're going, that the notion of exitus and reditus, right? That a mission is that which sends us out so that we can come back and return and be with God, right? I love this quotation he had, I think this is from Ratzinger, when God speaks his word of mission to me, I know myself fully. I find that when students have a sense of mission or have a sense of vocation, when a student knows where she's going with this complex thing we call an education, or even has an inkling, has a sense of where that's going, I don't have to worry about her anymore. That sense of Being called forth to something higher means I can let the horses run. And that's an amazing moment. I use a different phrase from the Presbyterian novelist, theologian, essayist, marvelous guy by the name of Frederick Buechner, Buechner, in a tiny little book called A Theological ABC. When you get to the letter V, he talks about vocation, and he says this amazing phrase that I've used many years, even as an English professor. Your vocation is where your deepest happiness meets the world's greatest needs. It's beautiful. And I find that students often struggle with the first half of that phrase. We have good students at UD. They all want to do something good for the world. But they struggle sometimes to find their way to that first half. What is it that makes me genuinely happy? Now, I can be terribly happy watching about 6 hours of soccer, drinking some beer, and eating a lot of chips. But that's not what makes one deeply happy, right? And when I was their age, these are my students in the front. Say hello to UD students. I thought what would make me deeply happy was to be a biochem major, go off and get an MD, PhD, find a cure for cancer, and end on the cover of the New York Times. God had other plans for me. And I became an English major and got a PhD in 14th century literature. And clearly what God wanted me to do is not find a cure for cancer, but to fix semicolons. Which is a very humbling come down for just finding a cure for cancer or fixing semicolons. But I get out of bed happy every day. It's what makes me deeply happy. That is, as Karol Wojtyla said, right, when we find our mission, when we find that vocation, it's that moment of fulfilling ourselves that brings us to ecstasy and gives us hope. So I think hope is really crucial. Students who have that sense of hope, being grounded in what makes them deeply happy so that they know that that is what God is wanting them to do, leads to that sort of deep happiness. And I find the anxiety and the depression that is so plaguing our students today just begins to float away. So that is the wonderful thing I've been thinking about all week long, and that I've been learning from everyone all week long, is the emphasis of this notion of the person as relation. And we do need to really work to build our built environment, our programming, our structures, to help students move beyond expressive individualism into a world of person as relation. I think it was Joe who put me onto David Brooks' article about thick communities. Our students live, unfortunately, too often in very thin communities. But a university as Polis has the chance of creating a thick community. That is, with thick relations with their professors, with their advisors, with their RAs, with their RCs, with, God help us, the Dean of Students, that they can have that sense of thick relation to all of their work. But also, as I've learned this week, I think the focus on the subjective and the subjective experience of our students. I was at a very fine panel on justice and the need for justice tempered with mercy. And my sense taken from that is to treat the student not just with justice and a sort of, or even a sense of simple mercy, but a sense to go into the subjective experience of what went wrong that you are now sitting in my office on a Tuesday afternoon, having done something very knuckleheaded over the weekend. What's the subjective experience that has led you to that place? But I think it also draws us into a world to think about how the subjective can draw students in their own way in a negative way. It's very clear, right, that the overvaluing of the subjective can lead the students into the world of anxiety, into the world of depression, and to get them out of that. And I just want to end with where Craig Calhoun sort of ended himself, right, in the notion of habits. And the habits, I love this as habitual capabilities and how habits are always embodied. And as we return, I think, to students working on habits, and not just the virtues as habits, but practical habits. When do you study? When do you actually exercise? When do you take a walk? What habits have you built in that can make you a productive, thoughtful, even happy? I loved him talking about his son. He says, I have ADHD. There's nothing I can do about this. And I loved his notion of that if we overvalorize a sort of subjective experience of I have ADHD and I can't do anything with it, I can't build any habits that might help with that, we're actually not helping that student. So I think I'll just end it here and say the marvelous thing that we have as the universities we are is we have this rich personalist tradition. We have a rich tradition that can take students from expressive individualism to person as relation, to being seen, and from being seen to discover a mission, and from discovering a mission to begin to build the habits that will allow them to achieve that mission and maybe just perhaps be happy. Thanks very much.
Wow, what a session. Fitting for a session on personalism, you're about to meet a third amazing person here. And what a beautiful set of talks together, from the broadest, most profound anthropology, culminating in John Paul II, to particular instantiation and practices at UD. And now you mentioned, Greg mentioned students getting off their screens. Well, now Kyle's going to dig us a little deeper into a particular practice that's related to screens. So it's a real treat to introduce President Kyle Washut. So, So, Kyle Washut grew up in Casper, Wyoming, and received his AA in political science and another one in Spanish from Casper College in '03. Over the summers, he worked in nuclear missile silos and coal mines, graduating from Thomas Aquinas College in '07, and then joining Wyoming Catholic College as her inaugural assistant dean for student life. After studying theology at the International Theological Institute in Austria, he returned as a full-time professor in 2012. He's taught multiple subjects across the college's curriculum. In the fall of 2019, he was named academic dean, and he served in that capacity for 4 years before being named the college president in August 2023. So please join me in welcoming President Kyle Washut.
So, Wyoming Catholic College requires its students to commit to a technology fast. I just want to get that right out there right now. Our students, since 2007, have checked in their cell phones. There are no televisions or video games, consoles on campus. There's no Wi-Fi in the dorms, and there's filtered internet access on the main campus. Okay, if you're already weirded out, I'm going to say something a little bit more radical. I think that if you are committed to the education of the whole person, as Wyoming Catholic College is, that at some level, every educational project needs to instantiate some form of this technology fast. Doesn't mean exactly the WCC form, but some form of a technology fast. Now, to get there, we have to make several claims. Some of them we've already made over the course of this conference. First, when we talk about persons, we're talking about minds. When there is not a mind, there is no spiritual potential for knowing the self, the world, and God, and therefore there's not a person. But when we're talking about human persons, we're talking about embodied minds. not ghosts in a machine, but an embodied mind that expresses its knowing in an intensely relational way, rooted in the body. And that takes on three main modes of knowing. First, the knowing in the body. I'm not going to come back to that. Second, the one we maybe more readily think of, knowing in abstraction. And third, a kind of knowing for the sake of acting, generally on bodies. Now, each one of those modes can be thought of in different ways. Cardinal Newman describes it as a poetic mode of knowledge, this first knowing in the body, followed by a philosophical mode of knowledge, the knowing in abstraction, followed by a practical mode of knowledge, the knowing in action. Or we could take it with Jacques Maritain and talk about a poetic mode of knowledge in contrast to conceptual knowing which can either be speculative or can be active or practical. Or we can follow Wendell Berry and say there's a sympathetic knowledge, a knowing in the body, a knowing relationally, that then is distinct from what Berry calls the purely rational, or the abstract on the one hand, and then the industrious or the active on the other. One way or another, I want to focus on that first knowing, the knowing in the body, what Jacques Maritain describes as the soul knows in the experience of the world, and the world is known in the experience of the soul. In poetic intuition, objective reality and subjectivity, the things we've been talking about, the world and the whole of the soul coexist inseparably. Sense and sensation are brought back to the heart, blood to the spirit, passion to intuition, and through the vital and non-conceptual act of the intellect, all the powers of the soul are actuated in their roots. Okay, that's very technical, exciting language, or not exciting, depending on how academic you are. But the point we want to make is this knowing in the body is where the relationships that we're talking about that constitute the person arise from. Now, there are, according to Cardinal Newman, three modes of education that are going to correspond to these three modes of knowing. And he says the church has mastered these three modes of education at three different times in her history. This poetic education, or the education of the relational in the body, he calls the genius of the Benedictine or the monastic education. The abstract education he sees as culminating especially in the Dominican or the scholastic tradition. And then he says the Jesuits really nailed the practical discernment, missional education. So in a very short talk, we don't have time to talk about the Dominican mode or the Jesuit mode. I want to focus especially on this monastic poetic mode of education. Now, when the monastics begin telling their poetic mode of education or practicing it, they do it in the context of a story, specifically the story of Adam and Eve. In unfallen Adam, this relational knowing that we're talking about was rooted in a direct experience of God that then radiated out into the body, and from that arose to more abstract knowing that we see in his naming of the animals, and into active knowing that we see in him tilling and keeping the garden. But after the fall, Adam and Eve lose this foundational relational knowledge, immediate knowledge of God. And so we see a series of broken relationships. A fractured self, a mutual hostility between persons and the world around them, a breakdown in communion between the human persons themselves, and a breakdown in relationship with God. So the monastic mode of education sees itself as concerned with responding to that first break, this rupture at this level. And therefore, it's a healing ministry of education that's cultivating this relational mind prior to working on the abstract contemplative thought or practical studies. And to do that, the monastic tradition does two main things. First, it goes into the wilderness. Following the example of the Israelites in Egypt, leaving Egypt, we go into the wilderness for education for three reasons: for purgation, for growth in virtue through challenge, and for the sake of a transformative encounter with God that creates a communion of persons, that constitutes a city in the desert. Now, when you're in the wilderness, you also do something. You do lots of things, but the important thing we want to focus on right now is you fast. And you fast for the same three reasons that we see that the monks go into the wilderness: for purgation from sin, for growth in self-knowledge and growth in virtue, and to dispose oneself to this transformative encounter with God that creates a communion of persons. And the monks see themselves as doing this by living as much as possible during the course of the fast, as if they're already in communion with the heavenly realm. So that means there's a kind of maximal approach to fasting here. How far can you go to be living in an intensely angelic relational mode? And so in the Desert Fathers, we hear crazy stories about fasting, living in little hovels, eating maybe, a piece of bread once a week, an extreme kind of fasting that sort of terrifies us when we're only thinking of fasting as a purgative approach. But I want to stress, too, that fasting is not merely concerned with food. For the monks, that fasting is also bound up with, as I noted, living in caves, living away from earthly artifice, a kind of fast from technology. Now, we're going to return to why that may be the case. So Catholic education is fundamentally an extension of the mystery of the redemption to our fallen condition, which is why the Church has always seen education as one of the spiritual works of mercy. Beginning with this deliberate cultivation of sympathetic or poetic knowledge as the ground for further education, we're responding to the need to go into the wilderness and to fast to reestablish relationship. So at Wyoming Catholic College, we take that very, very seriously and very literally. And beginning with our approach to poetic education, we bring our students into the wilderness, not just a remote town of Lander, far over 4 hours away from the nearest airport. But once even they're in this tiny little town in Lander, we send them further out into the mountains. And they spend about 10 weeks of their time at Wyoming Catholic College immersed in those mountains. But also, we take the fast very seriously. As I noted, we ask our students to fast from communicative technology because we're seeing the need for all three reasons that the monks go into the wilderness to fast: a purgation, a growth in self-knowledge and virtue, and a disposition to a transformative encounter with God and his creation, and the resulting formation of a communion of persons. So first, the purgative aspect. We've already hit on this. The keynote last night was talking about all the terrible things that readily give rise in terms of our own sinful responses to the technologies that are available to us. We can talk about how technology facilitates pornography. We can talk about how technology facilitates addiction. We can talk, or even an addiction to the smartphone. We can talk about how the technology allows for, as we hear from the tracking that we know that the tech companies are doing to us, the commodification and objectification of the users. Every time we're on our phone, we're fundamentally being reduced to a cog in a wheel for spending money. And we're encouraged to spend more money. Our avarice is inflamed. We get addicted to that, like we're scrolling through on a little slot machine as we scroll through our Facebook feed, and then again have the possibility of both inflaming avarice, inflaming addiction, and inflaming lust. So of course, in those situations, you want to fast from technology. Put the smartphone away, break the addiction. Great. That's just a fundamental level. Just like if you're an alcoholic or if you're a glutton, you need to fast so you stop with those intense responses. So too, it's good to fast. And as we see in the statistics, increasingly young people from as young as 11 or younger are getting into addictions to their smartphones, struggles with lust, struggle with pornography, struggles with avarice. So, base level, it's good to fast for that reason. But that's not the real fundamental reason for fasting from technology, though it's an essential starting point. We ask our students to fast for this growth in self-knowledge and growth in virtue. If anyone has tried to take the technology Sabbath that our keynote talked about last night, giving up your phone for a day, you probably quickly discover immediately checking your pockets because you imagine you felt a buzz. Or the difficulty of even doing things like standing in line or sitting in the bathroom and finding yourself anxious or bored or looking for something to distract yourself. The technological fast allows us to see in ourselves the unquiet, to see in ourselves the desire for distraction, to see in ourselves our concupiscences, our disordered passions. But it also invites us to grow in certain virtues. Again, technology expands our reach in really transformative ways that are really helpful. But at the same time, it has an effect on our own habits. Habits that we lose because we're constantly relying on the use of the communicative technology. So, what are some virtues that we want to see our students growing in? One, memory. If you can't constantly Google everything, you do have to practice the art of memory to be able to recall it. Two, communication. If you are not able to just communicate with an emoji, but have to do something with your facial expression and words, there is a kind of virtue of communication that arises necessarily. But more importantly, we see a presence to the reality around us. A presence to a reality that helps itself combat the individualism we've been talking about this weekend. It prevents us from making thought merely an act of ivory tower academics or merely a tool for purely pragmatic industrialists. You're grounded in a community and your thinking is contextualized. The conversations you have are there. And Joseph Pieper says, lastly, the giving up of technology ends a bit of distraction that enables us to learn to see again. Pieper already noted, this is well before smartphones or the internet, Pieper had already noted that we don't notice things. We don't notice the world around us. We don't notice people because there's too much. There's too many neon signs. There's too much noise. A technological fast enables us to learn to see. Anyone that has become as dependent as I am on Google Maps, not in Lander, Wyoming, but anywhere else, knows the experience. You don't notice the place around you because you're so accustomed to using the map to get you there. In fact, studies indicate that as they're using GPS more and more in certain Inuit cultures that are used to navigating the vast snowland plains of Canada, they're losing a kind of sense of place that normally helped them navigate as they rely more and more on the GPS. They're losing the sense of sight, the sense of awareness. So we want to develop this virtue. And lastly, so that's the purgative aspects of the technological fast, the self-knowledge and growth of virtue. But lastly, there's a kind of straining toward that heavenly life, a disposition to a transformational encounter with God and creation and the formation of a communion of real persons. That is at the root of our technology fast. In the narrative of the fall and the redemption, which we've already said formed the fundamental ground for the monastic education, the first instance of human artifice, of crafting raw natural ingredients to serve some human purpose, or we could say a kind of technology, are the fig leaves sewn together as a protective barrier against broken human relationships created by the fall. Now, the effect of this, just think about it. The moment we talk about putting on leaves, what's the effect of this? The effect of that, in part, is to camouflage the personhood of Adam and Eve, to make them look like plants. It was an effort not only to protect oneself, but to do so by abandoning personal relationships, not just with each other, but with their own bodies and the world at large. Irenaeus of Lyons describes this first response of Adam and Eve as an exaggerated response. Of course, we needed some kind of a response. We were no longer in Eden. And so God gave Adam and Eve garments of skin, garments of animals who have a sensitive relationship to the world around them. So, of course, we need to use our intelligence to create tools that help us navigate our relationship with each other, with animals, and with the wider world of nature. But we need to do it in such a way that is not an exaggerated response at the expense of personal relational knowledge. To understand this tension in these terms of these two modes of responding to the world around us, I think Wendell Berry is a helpful guide here. Wendell Berry makes a distinction between paths on the one hand and roads on the other. He notes that paths are little more than a habit that comes with a knowledge of a place. They're a ritual of familiarity, the perfect adaptation through experience and familiarity of movement to place. It obeys the natural contours. Such obstacles as the path meets, it goes around. All right, so the path is fundamentally a relational model of interacting with space. But a road, Wendell Berry notes, embodies a resistance against the landscape. Its wish is to avoid contact with the landscape. It seeks, so far as possible, to go over the country rather than through it. Its aspiration, as we see clearly in the example of our modern freeways, is to be a bridge. Its tendency is to translate place into space in order to traverse it with the least effort and destroy obstacles in its path. And in the case of our modern freeways, such roads are designed principally to facilitate profit and expensive entertainment. So the communicative technology of the smartphone, which in a way just intensifies the tendency of television and the internet, makes our place into a merely digital space to be ignored. And we ignore it as a way of facilitating unrestrained profit through the commodification of the user and offer in its place addictive entertainment. A break from communicative technologies gives us a chance to reestablish a place in which we're in real relationship, in which we can really encounter God giving us animal skins, responding to our fallen condition. And the effect we see at Wyoming Catholic College is that it's working. Our students form lively communities. We walk into the dining hall and there's not a screen in sight. We have an active dorm life. We have lower rates of depression than the national average. Still work to be done. Going back to a place with no screens does not actually take us to Eden. It only takes us to the 90s. Which despite my extreme nostalgia, I realize it's not perfect. There's work to be done. But the ground spring of the person is the sympathetic relational knowledge we've been discussing. It humanizes our abstract contemplation and our entrepreneurial zeal. In neglecting this first, we come to imagine thinking along the lines of the Cartesian dualism that my panelists talked about, an act of cold intellect inside a machine, and then we come to consider such thinking historically as a waste of time, and instead focus solely on what can be done with our thinking for the sake of acting, which when carried on has created the very situation of overwhelming addictive technology industry that we find ourselves in today. This return to an active cultivation of sympathetic knowledge as the groundwork for any Christian education remains a fundamental task of our day. And we need to at least do that in part by introducing some kind of a technological fast. Thank you.
Well, thanks to our three speakers, not only for the profundity of their wise talks, but their discipline in leaving us a little time at the end to have a few questions. So I invite you to come to the microphone up here if you have a question. And maybe we'll take... Can we do the thing where we take two at a time? We're down to 10 minutes. So, and then you can answer them as you wish, please.
Hi. Thank you for your presentations today. JP2 referenced that all human formation happens by way of self-knowledge, self-acceptance, and then self-gift. I've heard a lot about self-knowledge and self-gift. I wonder if you three might have an idea to unpack how self-acceptance might be referenced in like the three areas you are working.
we do one more while you get the microphone?
Sure. We heard references to both expressive individualism and to Wendell Berry's distinction between a path and a road. And I have personally been struck recently by, it seems that an essential call for educators is to help reorient students to a mode of knowing where, rather than as imposing a model, imposing our constructs on the world, instead being receptive to the world, that kind of change of posture. I wonder if you all could speak to what it might look like as institutions, or perhaps even as individual educators who might not have, say, the institutional power to bring about a technology fast or a 2-week pilgrimage in the wilderness, to take at least small steps in that direction.
Self-acceptance and receptivity.
All right. Thank you so much for the question. It's a great question, actually. When we speak of self-acceptance in relation to self-gift, actually it is a precondition to self-gift. Because how can you give something that you do not accept first? Self-gift is something, for John Paul II, something that is precious. Okay? But that calls for emptiness, self-emptiness. And you can only be empty of yourself if you know yourself first. And I think that's the answer to the question that you ask regarding self-gift in relation to self-acceptance. Also, I highlighted the importance of conscience. I think self-acceptance and conscience plays a crucial role in giving ourselves in education. Because if we don't accept, for instance, that we are ignorant of a specific thing, we cannot be conscientious enough to allow others to correct us. And we will bear false witnesses to others, to the persons who are listening to us, if we are not honest about our ignorance. So I think self-acceptance is something that is necessary in giving ourselves. Because it demands accepting that we are limited. It demands that we accept our mistakes. And that allows us to be educated and to become a good educator as well. So thank you.
It was a question for
Yes,
for
about
not
what,
you, in a sense,
yes,
right?
yeah, you're right. So what do you do if you're not lucky enough to be in the wilderness with a fast, right? So I will say, fundamentally, the question we're talking about is a spiritual discipline that needs to characterize all of us, whether we're on retreat in the wilderness or whether we're actually in the urban world. It's obviously a lot easier to do and requires at least some time of retreat and some time of fasting. But that cultivation is going to come in different ways. I'd say just even begin initially by memorizing a poem and delighting in the experience of the memorizing of a nature poem, talking about what happens to you in that context. Don't memorize the poem with any technology, just do it by speaking and then repeating. And create a space of conversation, create the classroom as a kind of moment of digital retreat, moment of encounter. At least there's a start. And then maybe send them out on a week-long backpacking trip with us. That'd be fun.
Yeah.
I just want to note my sister's Emily Jakoski. She went to Wyoming Catholic, and I've been there like 4 times. I miss your mountains. I miss the Byzantine liturgy. I miss it all. But I'm taking a class in philosophy of technology at Christendom. And one thing I wanted to ask Kyle Washut is, have you also noticed that when teenagers and young adults get off their smartphones, they actually have more energy, more mental energy? Because at least from what I've noticed, that tends to be the case. A lot of young people are tired, and maybe they sleep a lot, and they still don't have the energy to get through a day's work. So just maybe some comments on that would be helpful.
Hello, thank you so much. I also have a technology question. So it can seem that technology is very important in the majority of professions today. So with the technology fast, how can you incorporate it in a healthy way for the students?
Great.
So thank you.
All right. So first, on the energy question, we were walking across Notre Dame campus, and there were the Grubhub mobiles going around. And someone mentioned to me that, yeah, it's so difficult because students, as a general tendency, are retired and withdrawn into their dorms, and so this just seems to facilitate that. And it hadn't occurred to me that that was a thing that characterized students, because it's certainly not what characterizes our students. So at least anecdotally, our students are bubbling with energy. That creates different problems for student life. But they do seem to have a lot more energy. I don't have a comparison of what were they like when they were on their smartphones versus when they're not, but I do see them as very energetic. On the technology question, about the work question, there we see the fundamental tension between this Jesuit model of education, right, which is an education for vocation for work, and this Benedictine model of education, the education of the fast. How you put those two together is really difficult, I grant. But I think if you just ignore the question of the technology fast, you end up sort of hyper-tracking the goal of earning as what's primary in education, not the goal of relationship. That being said, my experience with our students is they don't tend to be stumped by how to use a smartphone or how to network on social media after a 3-month fast. They've been growing up with this technology all their life. Maybe they're not equipped with coding or some of these more advanced things, but that's not going to come from having a smartphone in your pocket either. So it's not clear to me that there's really essential job skills that they're losing from a 3-month fast, and then they pick up their smartphone at Christmas.
Thank you so much to the whole panel, and especially our president, Mr. Washut. I'm from WCC. And I was just kind of wondering, a question for all of y'all is, the shocking thing for me is not going into Wyoming Catholic and having all these insane policies, but it's going out of it into the airports and into, me and some of my fellow students have realized the same thing. The shocking thing is going back into it. I think that's more unnatural. How do y'all recommend that, either what do we do after graduation, right, to continue this community, and especially to Dr. Roper, how do we make the United States WCC-esque, or also like, yeah. Well,
my question was about the identity of Catholic institutions. I think there tends to be kind of a split in the vocation of Catholic institutions where we don't know whether we're a liberal arts or academic institution. We don't know whether we're a boot camp for evangelization, and we don't know whether we're career prep. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on reconciling those identities within a Catholic college.
How to make the whole USA like Wyoming Catholic. I don't think that's the right goal, I would say first. For one thing, that would mean knocking down the whole DFW Metroplex and planting the Rocky Mountains there, which is not a bad thing, because Dallas is not a particularly attractive city. But I think really what the answer to your question is about, this notion of a spiritual discipline. I don't think Wyoming Catholic is trying to make the whole country like Lander, Wyoming. If so, that's, quite an act of hubris. But it is, I think, trying, right, to develop certain disciplines, right? And this is what I was trying to say about habits. I think if a university hasn't established certain habits, right, UD is trying to, right, create the habits of being playfully serious and seriously playful. I mean, I really believe this. We're Saint Philip Neri really is our patron saint. Our students are goofy. And they go out into the world, and they carry that sort of joy and goofiness with them. It's not the same thing as Wyoming Catholic, and that, I think, answers the second question. Is I'm now that I've as a dean of students, I hang out with Ave Maria people and Benedictine people and Franciscan people, and I come here, and what strikes me is the astonishing a variety of charisms. And the Catholic Church has always had this beautiful variety of charisms. And to ask every place to be UD, for instance, is, I think, a deep mistake. There's really only so many of these people I want out in the world. And sorry, Alethea. But there's also, only Franciscan, for instance, has a very different charism and a very different beauty to them. I came away from a few days of Franciscan realizing that the heroes amongst the students there run off to inner city ministry immediately, right? The heroes at UD go to think tanks in DC and physics programs at Harvard. Those are just different charisms and different beautiful things. Now, what unites us, right, is, I think, Catholic personalism, is that this focus upon, developing a deep sense of the human person in relation to God. But to ask me to have stayed in biochemistry would have been, I think, a violence to my vocation. To ask, Wyoming Catholic to be UD, I think would be a diminishment of that. But if we are authentically Catholic in our approach to each of these charisms, I say let 1,000 flowers bloom, and the richness that we can achieve in this country by that is really marvelous. I'm going to jump in really quickly with, I talk about my 1952 Jersey carpenter analogy. I say if you were a carpenter in New Jersey in 1952, and you've never been to college yourself, but you wanted, you have 8 kids, and you want to send the first one off to school, you would have known exactly where to send him. You would have sent him to a Jesuit university. You could not have said the word ratio studiorum to save your soul, but you knew the good Jesuit fathers were going to take care of your son and form him and give him a very fine education. I think for a long time we lost that. Parents weren't really sure where they could send their son or daughter to school. And I think with the growth of the Newman schools and with a certain return of other schools, to attempting to be authentically Catholic, to care for the person, to develop habits and virtues in their students, and increase their intellectual capabilities, then I think there's been this powerful thing. And I'm actually very excited about where Catholic education, precisely because of this variety, because there are Kyles in the world, and not me, who did all my Boy Scout days, and now I would freeze to death because I'm a Southern boy, so I don't want to go out into his world.
I'll just say, as we talk about what model there is for Catholic education, I completely agree with Greg about the variety. I do think that it is important in whatever way that at some level, wilderness as a spiritual reality, if not a literal, and a fast, especially from, I think, communicative technologies, is part of that, not because, our vocation is a boot camp for evangelization or job training or whatever the case may be, but because I think these 3 fundamental modes of thinking, the poetic mode, the philosophical, and the active, characterize in different charisms all aspects of Catholic education. And the challenge in each charism is to figure out how do you realize that. Yeah. I think we do pretty well, but I think that's the challenge for all of us, is to be discerning how do we realize these 3 modes in our distinctive charism.
Well, this is a fantastic and deeply personal session, so join me in thanking our speakers.